Welcome to the ASPR podcast Inside Conflict with Moritz Ehrmann. So in our previous episode of ASPR's Inside Conflict, we had a fascinating discussion on the implications of Iraq's parliamentary elections, government formation, and their implications for Iraq's nascent democracy and the country's stability and welfare. In the course of the next two episodes, we will be discussing the challenges that will be faced by the next government, whatever the final shape it may take. With us are again two eminent experts on Iraqi affairs, Ambassador Dr. George Bustin and Mr. Sajjad Jihad. Ambassador Dr. George Bustin is an esteemed retired member of the Hungarian Foreign Service. He has extensive diplomatic experience, including posts as ambassador of Hungary in Libya, Indonesia, and Iran. And very importantly, for this discussion, of course, he was from 2011 to 2017 Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General with the UN's mission in Iraq, UNAMI. Currently, Ambassador Bustin is a visiting research professor at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. Before that, he was a most valuable consultant for the ASPR's activities in Iraq. Most welcome to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director, and I'm very appreciative of you inviting me.
Mr. Sajjad Jihad, on the other hand, is an Iraqi political analyst based in Baghdad. His focus is on public policy and governance in Iraq, and he also works on capacity building of public institutions and civil society organizations. Mr. Jihad is a fellow at the Century International and director of the Shia Politics Working Group. He is the former managing director of the Al Bayan Center, an Iraqi policy institute, and he also served as a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome also to you, Mr. Jihad.
Thank you, Moritz. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, so in this episode, we will be discussing mainly about the challenges that will be faced by any incoming new Iraqi government. And one, I guess, very pressing issue that has been around for quite a while and that will certainly continue to be in front of any new Iraqi government is the question of the future of the popular mobilization forces. So the current outgoing government has had a lot of challenges related to these groups. What do you expect a next government to be able to do about this problematic? So questions like integrating different militia units into regular forces, perhaps disarming some others, dealing with the ones that seemingly do not want to integrate in any of the above described ways. What comes to your mind about this very complicated issue? Perhaps Sajjad, since you're in Baghdad, let us start with you.
Thanks, Moritz. It's a good question. I think we have to keep in mind that the PMF is a formal institution. It is governed by a law, and it is a permanent institution. It's not going to be replaced. I don't think any of the forces in it are going to be integrated into the army or police. This is something that we have to look at in a sort of very long term. By and large, the PMF has taken quite a bit of time. They've been very slow in their progress in terms of making sure they can integrate the forces within the PMF properly. They're made up of various groups, more than 50, 60 groups now. And the idea was how to sort of homogenize the PMF, how to get sort of clear strategy on command and control, what are the lines of command as well within the various brigades. And that has been sort of slow going. It hasn't been done properly and fully yet. There are still obviously the political connections where you have parties who are vying for seats in parliament, and at the same time they have an armed wing which is represented in the PMF. Severing that connection has been difficult and slow going. But for the future, I think what we can expect is a clear sort of line to be drawn between groups who are in the PMF and nominally under the control of the Prime Minister, and groups that have popped up, maybe they are fronts, maybe they are sort of a new extremist type groups that are outside the PMF. And the government is very likely to tackle the second, but will struggle to deal with the groups who are already in the PMF who are causing problems for the government. Groups have been mentioned like Kata'ib Hezbollah, Asab al-Haq, and a few others who have even sort of threatened the Prime Minister, been very critical of him. That's where the real challenge is. What do you do with groups that are formally part of the Iraqi armed forces? They're not, sort of just groups who are attacking various interests. They are formally part of the security forces. And that's where I think the government has struggled so far, the past three governments. And certainly I can see that being a challenge for future governments. As for the second part, the groups who are operating outside the PMF, the new groups, the criminal elements especially, I think those, the next government will probably take a harder line than the previous ones, especially if it is sort of backed by the Sadrist, Muqtada Sadr, who has been very critical of these groups. I think we can expect more sort of military security activity, but also I think there'll be a push on the military front to sever the connections and support for these groups, whether it is from Iran or whether it is from other groups inside Iraq. The idea is to go after these groups as criminal elements, to separate them off from the rest of the armed groups that we have inside the country. Long term, the idea of reintegration, I think, is a challenge. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think DDR or SSR is entirely realistic either. I think, like I say, these are groups that are going to be here for the long term, and they are sanctioned by law. They are here to exist as part of the security forces. But I think also the demilitarization of society as a whole is a key goal. I travel regularly. I'm in Basra. I was in Basra recently, and I travel up to Mosul and other areas. There is a lot of military presence, and under various guises, whether it's the police, the army, the PMF, local defense forces, local police, for example. It's just too much. And sometimes, the responsibility is unclear. If something goes wrong, who is responsible? Is it the governor? Is it the Prime Minister? Is it the Minister of Defense? Is it the local sort of police commander or local army commander? And the friction that we have between these groups is evident. And the fact that we have also, for example, Turkish military presence in the Kurdistan region, airstrikes taking place in northern part of Iraq, near Sinjar, for example, where multiple groups are competing. The presence of unauthorized forces like the PKK, for example, and their supporters inside Iraq, or PMF groups who are operating in areas where they really shouldn't be. They are no longer required to be there, or they're not acting under the direction and command of the Prime Minister. So part of that is also sort of the too many forces in the country and the demilitarization of society, checkpoints, frequently that hinder the movement of people. And yet at the same time, despite having sort of over 1 million people in the security forces and armed forces, we still have problems with facing ISIS, Daesh. They're very active in many parts of the country. So it's, how do we have so many groups? How do we have so many people who have weapons officially, working for the state? And at the same time, we struggle with terrorism, we struggle with Daesh, we struggle with all these other military and security issues. And I think that's something that, again, we have to sort of work on a strategic level. Yes, we have a problem with specific groups, but we also have a problem in our military and security strategy. It's not sort of conducted in a cohesive manner. And I think the next few governments will struggle with this.
Thanks a lot, Jihad. I mean, this was enormously comprehensive analysis. Probably not very easy for Dr. George to build on this. I will, perhaps to make it a bit easier for you, I will add another layer of complication to this discussion. Sajjad also already mentioned it. The Popular Mobilization Forces as such, as an institution, were of course formed in response to the invasion of the so-called Islamic State. Now, one can say that the so-called Islamic State has been defeated in a territorial sense. Yet they are still about and still staging things like prison breaks, attacks against the military, attacks against civilians. So on the background of this, how do you see sort of possible recent resurgence of the activities of the so-called Islamic State and the relation to the problematic of the PMF in the sense that Sajjad described?
Thank you very much. I was also listening to Sajjad with great interest and congratulate him on providing us such an elaborate description of what are the problems surrounding the PMF. However, and even before I answer your question, let me hark back to one element of Sajjad's description, and this is the implications of the existence of the PMF, even as it is an organization in principle legitimized by law and belonging under the prime minister. I think there is a fundamental problem here that Iraqi society has very serious doubts about certain elements of the PMF and the rationale behind the PMF as such. In any country, an army is created to protect the borders from outside enemies. The police and the security organizations are meant to take care of internal order. Anything in between is in a very precarious situation because it would be very difficult to legitimize. And let me also go back to the latest elections in Iraq, which were meant to be a watershed moment because they were meant to open a new phase in the country's progress. However, and very sadly, only about 30% of all Iraqis participated. And one reason that I keep hearing from my Iraqi interlocutors on this very low participations is exactly the fear and the resentment that the people felt towards the armed groups, be the armed groups blessed by the state or armed groups, non-state actors outside the realm of the state. However, I think the PMF played a significant and important role, we cannot deny it, in the initial phase of the struggle against ISIS, before the anti-ISIS coalition could really play its role in combating terrorism. However, now the balance sheet is becoming more doubtful. I think one of the important and very significant achievements of Iraq is building democracy, building up democratic institutions. Anything that impedes this process is harmful for Iraq. And sadly, this is something that the politicians of Iraq cannot consider enough because, as we know, the PMF, and let me add here that I fully understand that our distinguished interlocutor, Sajjad, was economic on talking about this. The PMF is tied in many, many ways to a neighbor country. And in this regard, of course, I know that there are differences inside the organization. However, the general Iraqi social perspective on the PMF is also influenced by this fact. And here, of course, I have to say that if we would like to see Iraq progress to the next elections with a clear determination that the level of participation would be high and that all Iraqis would feel inclined to have a say in the process, then the next government should make sure to find a solution to this problem. In other words, there will be no free and fair elections in Iraq under the threat of arms, whoever those arms will belong to. And here let me again come back to your question, Moritz, when you ask about whether or not the resurgence of ISIL is somehow related to the performance of the PMF. I don't think that this is a PMF problem. I think that the ISIS resurgence has to do more with the unaddressed problems of the justice system, the unaddressed problems of social grievances, and the whole unaddressed problem of how regionalism and sectarianism is being treated. I wish and hope that the new government will have answers, because these answers are missing for a very long time, actually since 2014 and even before. Because what caused the resurgence, the appearance, and then the amazing sweep of ISIL over 1/3 of Iraq was exactly the marginalization that the Sunni community in Iraq felt. And I am loath to say, and I regret it very much, I have to say this, that most of these problems are still being unaddressed. And let us hope that the new government will have answers, and that it will be a government inclusive enough to have the means and ways to tackle these problems meaningfully.
Yeah, thank you very much. You already pointed to another set of challenges that the Iraqi government and state has faced for quite a while and will continue to face in the future, which is the problematic relating to questions of, on the one hand, reconstruction of areas that have been affected by the conflict with the IS. And at the same time, so reconstruction, of course, in a physical sense, but also in the sense of reconstructing society or reconciling society, which is an effort that takes often place on a very local level. So amongst, for example, in the province of Nineveh, those who supported or seemingly supported the IS regime when it was there, and those who had to run away, either because they opposed it or because they were of groups that were simply not ethnic or religious, that were simply not tolerated by this organization. Sajjad, coming back to you, how do you see this process evolving? It's a very cumbersome and slow process. How do you see this going forward in the next months and years?
Well, I think the issues with governance are long-standing; they're not new, and as just mentioned, I think they will continue for quite a while. We struggle with local governance. We struggle with making people feel that they are citizens of the country, that there is a government that actually cares about them, that resources are distributed amongst the population equally, that rule of law is intact, that grievances will be addressed, that the justice system works. The average Iraqi citizen does not feel any of these things. They feel like there's flaws in every one of these. So therefore they have to rely on their tribe, their religious leader, their political leader, their sort of neighborhood chief. They have to rely on everything but the state to compensate for the state's weakness in providing good governance. And this extends to everything: services, water, schools, health, roads, finding economic opportunities, jobs, reconstruction, as you mentioned, and so many other elements. People just feel the state is not there for them, whether it's right at the local level or it's at the federal level. It's the same result. People feel that there is no real government to provide for them. And that's why they have to turn to some of these other groups. And I think the longer term issue is that people will continue to not trust the government to provide. And therefore, when a group pops up like ISIS, like Daesh, some people feel like this is an alternative. Maybe viable, maybe not, but they feel that this is an alternative and they must consider it. And therefore, you feel, some people join not because they're ideologues, not because they believe in the ideology of groups like Daesh, but because they get a job They offer them a job as a driver, as a courier, as a cook, as as anything else. Or they provide farmers with some income, and they make use of their lands or their products. And that desperation that people have, I think it's probably going to increase. We have a demographic issue in the country. Our population rises by over 1 million people per year. The large majority of the Iraqi population is under the age of 30. Over 60% are under the age of 30. We have over 5 million people not in education, employment, or training who are under the age of 30. They have nothing. They have nowhere to go and nothing to do. Poverty is widespread from north to south, and our struggles with water and electricity are well documented. I don't think those things will improve in the short term. I think they will get worse. And as that happens, then there is more space, obviously, for extremism. There is more space for non-state actors to sort of step in. One of the things that the country must do is take advantage of high oil prices and immediately use some of that wealth to sort of spend on infrastructure, to make investment conditions better so that foreign investors can come into the country, to sort of give more capacity to local governments, to the governors and to local departments to quickly get people to work, whether it's reconstruction, whether it's rebuilding schools, whether it's getting hospitals open, whether it's improving transport routes, but to show that they're making an effort to try to improve these things. If not, and people see oil prices at $100, and yet, in Mosul, several neighborhoods are still sort of flattened. There is complete carnage and damage, and it just looks like it's come out of a war. Of course, people will feel that there's something, wrong, and therefore this current system is corrupt and needs to be replaced. And if there is an alternative, it could be Daesh, it could be others, then people will seek that alternative. And so I think governance is at the heart of the issue, and it's what led to grievances in the past. But also, if you look at what's happening in the southern part of Iraq, the protests that keep breaking out, people just feel that they are marginalized, that they have nothing, and the government cares not about them. I mean, there hasn't been a war in Nasiriyah and parts of Basra and others for many years now, but it looks in some parts like they just came out of a war. Roads are not there, schools are not functioning, water systems are not functioning, electricity is down, and it just looks like there is no government. And I think that will lead to more anger. And as I say, these millions of young people with nothing to do, I think they will sort of start to seek more aggressive means of protest or of confronting the state, and that could only spell disaster in the medium to long term, in my view.
Thanks a lot, Sajjad. Again, a very, very comprehensive answer to the question. George, perhaps if building on that and thinking about sort of issues that need to be tackled in society beyond sort of practical governance related measures, which are of course a very strong part of the grievances and of the rifts in society. But how about sort of the very direct acts of reconciliation that need to happen between the different parts, the different segments of Iraqi society? How do you see that situation progressing and going forward?
Well, thank you. I see some glimmer of hope. The general picture, of course, is not encouraging, and I agree with Sajjad. All analysts, when talking about Iraq, can enumerate a full catalogue of issues and problems and what should be done. And we know perfectly well that these matters cannot be addressed at one go. However, let us not deny that Iraq has progressed in certain areas in a very encouraging way. And I believe that the former sectarian narrative that was so typical of the country during and after the years of ISIL has diminished, and this is a very good sign. I believe that what we see today as attempts at coalition building are very much based on this positive process, which has created some semblance of dialogue between this previously totally disparate groups, which were not even in a in a national or a broad national dialogue. I believe that today a new government will have a much better position in terms of seeking out those topics where Iraqis can be brought together. And let us hope that the regional environment will also be conducive. Here I have to, of course, say a word about the ongoing talks between Iran and its international partners on renegotiating the nuclear agreement. I think it will have a beneficial effect on Iraq, and it will help the kind of reconciliation that we are hoping for inside Iraqi society. Having said that, I believe that there is still a very high level of marginalization. And we have seen a bright moment last year when Pope Francis paid a visit to Iraq. This was a very symbolic visit, but both the visit and his meeting with Grand Ayatollah Sistani carried a glimmer of hope, not only for the Christians of Iraq, but essentially for all other minority groups that had to face the very harsh realities of the previous years. I think all Iraqis now come to understand that the country is not the exclusive monopoly of just one group. And this might also facilitate a re-engagement that spans wider segments of society and spans the regional issues. Let us not forget that sadly, a major divide between two essential components of Iraqi society, Arabs and Kurds, is still untreated. I believe that if and when there will be a common will to address the outstanding issues, and we have seen the Supreme Federal Court making this very bold decision on the fate of oil in Kurdistan, I do not argue with what the court has said, but I also have to add that such a decision can only be implemented if there is a very high degree of trust between those two components. And that trust, sadly, is missing. I will not want to say whose mistake this is, but it will take a lot of hard effort to reconcile those interests which are currently in conflict. And of course, we can also say that other regionalisms inside Iraq are also adding to the complexity of the problem. We are very well aware that the South is resentful, and justly resentful, about the distribution of development funds. And I have to agree with Sajjad, and sadly my own personal experience when visiting the South was very dismal and very sad, because I have seen no progress. During my 6 years spent in Iraq, I have seen no progress whatsoever in the South. And this is an affront and a gross injustice to the people of the South, who are major contributors to the welfare of Iraq. So I can tell you that the picture is, of course, gloomy, but it is not bereft of hope. And with a growing sense of national responsibility in all sectors of Iraqi society, and more confidence, let us hope, in the political process after a new government has been ushered in, and hopefully it will be an inclusive government, these problems can gradually be addressed together with all the other problems that Jihad has been referring to.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador George. This was a very good ending point to our discussion. It's always good to end on a note of hope. And certainly, I mean, what you pointed out in terms of at least the narratives that did so much to fuel the conflicts of the past have greatly nuanced. And indeed, in very practical terms, the fact that the oil price, which is such a major part of the Iraqi national income, is at such a height. And just remember comparing it to 2 years ago in the midst of 2020, when it was less than half of what it is today. This is indeed something that we can only hope for the government would capitalize on. I thank both of you very much for this extremely comprehensive and informative discussion. We will keep discussing on the sort of more geopolitical side of Iraqi's affairs in the next episode. So looking forward to continuing the discussion with you soon. Goodbye. Subscribe to our podcast or visit the website insideconflict.com. For more information about the work of the ASPR, visit aspr.ac.at. Until next time.